Hello everyone, it's time for a new audiobook. Today we have The War with Audin. Fair warning, this story has spoilers for the Portal War saga, so if you haven't listened to that series yet, you should do so first. Okay, warning given. Now, did you ever wonder what happened in Audin after Otto left with the Chamber of Eternity? Well, you're about to find out. For those of you listening to the early ad-free version of this video, thank you so much for joining my Ream subscription and supporting the channel. It's much appreciated. One other item of note, if you see any of my audiobooks on a channel other than this one, please let me know since whoever posted it doesn't have permission to do so. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get started.
Ilsa Watt fumbled to connect the final mithril linkage in the Mark V armor's upper front plate. Upside down, arms fully extended into the chest of the 30-meter-tall armor, she couldn't quite reach it. Outside, muted thuds and booms made it nearly impossible to concentrate. Didn't those idiots know how important her work was? She kicked her legs and inched a little deeper into the Mark V. The tips of her fingers finally made contact with the linkage. Ether surged out and fused them together. Energy flowed from the power crystal, coloring the mithril blue. Good. It should be working now. She pushed against a reinforcing strut and wiggled around, trying in vain to push herself back out. Nothing doing. She'd gotten totally stuck. If she were capable of feeling embarrassed, being stuck upside down, her bare legs and small clothes visible to anyone that walked by, would certainly have left her red-faced. Of course, she didn't care in the least what anyone thought. But she did care about getting out of here and calibrating the control system. "Little help!" she shouted. The armory had been nearly empty since one of the assistants had helped kidnap Lord Shank's apprentice. They were doing another round of interviews to make sure there were no more spies lurking about. And while Ilsa approved of the increased security, the lack of help annoyed her to no end. Especially now. "Hey! Can anyone hear me? I need some help!" A strong hand grasped her ankle and pulled. She popped out and nearly landed on her butt. Someone caught her at the last moment. Ilsa brushed the hair out of her eyes and found the familiar, youthful face of Curtis Yates looking back at her. Curtis was only 20, and already the finest armor pilot in the Audin military. He'd been assigned as the Mark V-1's primary operator, standing nearly 6 feet tall and sporting short blonde hair and a scattering of freckles across the bridge of his nose. Curtis looked like he should still be in school. "Thanks," she said. "And good timing. I'm ready to calibrate the controls. Get in." An especially loud crash sounded, drawing a grimace. "Could they keep it down out there? This is hard enough without all the noise." Curtis stared at her. "Are you joking, Ilsa?" "About what?" "An invasion force has Audin surrounded. They're working on smashing through the wall now. Didn't you hear the other armor deploy?" She did her best to process that as she looked around at the empty armor stalls. That explained the earlier racket that nearly caused her to mess up a different, but equally vital connection. "I've been busy. Now get in the cockpit. We need to get the Mark V calibrated so you can go fight." Curtis shook his head, but obediently climbed the ladder and eased into the control chamber. He slid his hands into the arm slots and his legs into their slots. When he was locked into place, a helmet descended and covered his head. Power surged through his body as he became one with the armor. She never tired of watching the process. "How does the link feel?" Ilsa asked. "No issues. The right eye is a little blurry, but that's it." Ilsa reached through the ether and adjusted the flow to the right eye. "Better?" "Perfect." "Okay, stand up and take a few steps." He did so. As always, the first step was wobbly. Suddenly having a 50-foot stride took a second to get used to, even for someone as experienced as Curtis. The stone floor vibrated when his metal foot hit it. By the third step, he moved as naturally as if he was using his own body. "Any problems?" Ilsa asked. "No, I'm all good." "Okay, get out there and fight." Lord Audin wanted both Mark V's deployed. John should be here soon for number 2. He'd be better off fighting in one of the Mark IVs. I've got at least a week's work to get number 2 ready for battle. I don't think we have a week, Best get to the castle. If the invaders breach the wall, that'll be the safest place for you." She waved him off and went right to the second Mark V. She appreciated Curtis's concern, but if the enemy made it inside the city, she could trot over to the castle in half a minute. Until then, she'd keep working. The massive suit of armor clanked out of the armory, and she turned her focus to its twin brother. The mithril Lord Shank had provided made it so much simpler to complete her babies, especially after he showed her how to smelt the mithril properly. Such a simple spell, yet she'd never even thought about using magic directly to enhance the effects of heat or any other natural phenomenon. Just went to show you how much there was to learn. The more she thought about it, the more Ilsa wished she'd taken Lord Shank up on his offer to return with him to his empire. It would have expanded her horizons far more than anything she might accomplish here. But as she'd said, Lord Audin would never let her leave. She shrugged and considered what needed to be done to number 2. Curtis guided the Mark V out of the armory, then took off at a sprint toward the walls. He glanced back once, then put Ilsa out of his mind. She'd be far safer there than almost anywhere in the city. He mostly worried that she'd get so focused on her work that she wouldn't realize they'd lost until an enemy soldier poked her in the butt with his spear. The streets were totally empty, which meant the people were staying inside and safe, or at least out of the way. So many lives depended on what the army did today. He felt the pressure keenly, far more than when he fought in some border skirmish 500 miles north. He clenched his fist. If anyone thought Audin would go down easy, he'd be happy to explain their mistake to them. He spotted a Mark IV with a red flag jutting from its right shoulder. That would be the armor commander. A slight correction to his path brought him to a halt beside the commander. "Reporting for duty, sir." He used the suit-to-suit broadcast system to speak directly to the commander. "So that crazy girl finally got it working. Not a minute too soon. The combined invasion force isn't fooling around. They've got us outnumbered at least 3-1. That armor better be everything she said and then some, or we're going to be in trouble." If they were that badly outnumbered, Curtis doubted even the Mark V would be enough to turn the tide. Nevertheless, he'd give it his all. "Orders, sir?" "Join the defenders at the main gate. That's where they've concentrated the bulk of their forces. If the fight is still going when you reach 1 hour of operating time remaining, go into escape and evasion. We don't want them getting their hands on a functional Mark V. Curtis grimaced. Running away wasn't his style, but he understood where the commander was coming from. Besides, if they couldn't win this fight in 7 hours, they weren't going to. "Understood, sir. No one will get this unit while I'm alive." He turned and hurried over to the main gate. Half their armor units had lined up in 3 rows facing the open portcullis. The human-sized units took the flanks, while the Mark IIIs and IVs defended the center of the line. Unlike an infantry line, the armor was spaced out to let the huge suits swing their oversized swords freely. The constant pounding of enemy armor made him wince. Crunches from breaking wood made it clear that the outer gate wouldn't last much longer. The wall had been cleared of archers and infantry. In a heavy armor fight, arrows and spears amounted to nothing. Regular soldiers were more apt to get stepped on than accomplish anything useful. "Curtis Yates in the Mark V reporting for combat. Who's the ranking officer?" Unlike the armor commander, the front-line commander never marked his armor. That would be like waving a sign saying, "Come and kill me." "Take the center. Front line, Yates." He didn't know which unit the voice came from, but the other suits shifted aside to make room for him. 3 strides saw him in place. Curtis reached back and disconnected his greatsword from its harness. At 30 paces long and 3 wide, the Mark V's sword was even heavier than the Mark IV's, and those weighed over a ton each. Despite that, he found it shifted effortlessly in his hands. That spoke volumes about the power increase between armor generations. With a horrible crunch of shattering wood, an axe head big enough to fell most trees with a single blow made splinters out of the top of the gate. He caught his first glimpse of the enemy armor outside. It looked similar to their Mark IV's, only blockier and painted deep blue. Unless he was mistaken, that meant the armor belonged to Bandon's army. What were they doing here? Bandon was a good 1,000 miles north, and their nearest fort half that. He shook his head as the giant axe took another chunk out of the gate. It didn't matter how they got here. He'd send them back north in pieces. Remember, let the first rank inside the wall before you attack. The frontline commander's voice came through the magical link all the armor shared. The spell wouldn't let the enemy listen in, unlike the external speakers. Acknowledged, Curtis said. It was a standard tactic. Let a handful of units in, slam the portcullis shut, and thus divide their forces. It was a good trick, but it only worked once. The axe-wielding enemy armor finished its task and stepped back to let a different Mark IV, this one armed with what looked like a 2-ton sledgehammer, take the lead. That hammer gave Curtis a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. It stomped through the ruined gate, then stopped before passing under the arch that supported the portcullis. Just as Curtis feared, the hammer went back in slow motion. He couldn't let them destroy the last barrier without a fight. His sword went up, and he charged. The Mark V leapt forward at his command, faster than any unit he'd ever piloted. The hammer wielder swung at the arch. Halfway to the target, Curtis's sword pierced through the enemy Mark IV's shoulder, sending its arm, hammer and all, crashing to the ground. He stepped back and chopped down, crushing its head and blinding the pilot. A final front kick sent it sprawling backward to crash halfway through the first gate. Curtis retreated to his starting position. Good call, Yates, his commander said. Looks like the Mark V lives up to all the rumors. Thank you, sir. Curtis could hardly believe the new unit's power. He'd heard Ilsa talking with Lord Audin and knew she thought it would be something special, but he never imagined it would be this special. Pity they didn't have time to get the second unit online. 2 of them would have been unstoppable. 2 enemy Mark IIIs pulled the damaged unit out of the way. If they kept coming one at a time, Curtis felt certain he could hold them off until his power crystal ran down. Of course, the enemy had the same power issue with their units, and they must have more hours of operation on theirs than he did. It didn't feel like much of an advantage, but he'd take what he could get. He wanted a better look at their movements, but didn't dare leave his place in the formation. Having some idea what was coming would make it easier to plan his next move. Spotters say they're pulling back, the armor commander said over the internal speakers. You can rest for a moment, but don't leave your armor. The bastards aren't going far. At Curtis's mental command, his armor took a knee and went into low power mode. That would extend his time of operation, at least a little. All around him, the other units did the same. It was a waiting game now. Dawson Gale stood, arms crossed, and watched the combined invasion force slowly back away from Audin's gate. 2 of the heavy armor units were dragging a third that looked like its head had been smashed in. For all its power, the magical armor was far from invincible. He'd made that point to everyone willing to listen. Not that many were. As a member of the Montague Rangers, he wouldn't be taking part in the assault, or so the general had said. Considering the florid-faced pig was currently making his way toward Dawson and his rangers, the plan must have changed. When the general was 5 strides away, Dawson barked, "Attention!" He and the dozen rangers with him snapped arrows straight and brought their hands with fingers straightened to their temples in a crisp salute. None of them meant it. To a man, they despised General Irving. The lazy, useless excuse for an officer had only one thing to recommend him for the position of Supreme Commander of the Montague Army, and that was being King Jacob Irving the 21st's younger brother. The army would have been better served by a competent no-name, but that wasn't the way these things worked, or so a sensible colonel had explained to Dawson years ago. "At ease," General Irving said. "First Ranger Gale, I know I told you earlier that your team wouldn't be participating in this assault, but the situation has changed." Dawson shifted and clasped his hands behind his back. "How so, sir?" "Audin has a new suit of magical armor. It's made short work of our best unit. No way can we get through the gate while it's active. I want you and your rangers to sneak over the wall and take out the pilot." Dawson nodded. Not an easy mission, but doable as long as everyone was looking at the army out front. If they follow standard siege protocol, they should rest the pilots in shifts. We can get in and watch for the new unit to power down, then strike. Might take a few hours. The general waved a hand. We're doing nothing while the new unit is active. Take as long as you need. Just get it done. When you've completed the mission, send up a crimson flare. Yes, sir. If you could order a feint or two toward the gate to keep them focused on you, that would make sneaking in easier. Not a problem. The Fordham delegation hasn't done anything useful yet. I'll speak to their commander. He's young and eager. You know the type. He'll jump at anything to make himself look good. Just like you would, as long as it didn't endanger your hide, Dawson thought but didn't say. Give us an hour to get in position before you make the feint, sir. He hastened to add that last honorific. Dawson had come close to giving the general an order, and that would have been the end of his days as First Ranger. General Irving had a prickly sense of pride, and took anything even hinting at disrespect in the worst possible way. Dealing with him was like walking on eggshells. You never knew when something might break. The general gave Dawson a long look, then nodded once and stalked back the way he'd come. That had been too close. Must be nice having a king for your brother, one of the guys muttered. Stow that talk. Keep your opinions to yourself. We've got a mission to carry out, and I'd just as soon still be part of the Rangers when we come back. Dawson met each man's gaze and held it until they looked away. Damned if he was going to lose a good man for nothing more than speaking out of turn. Good. Sergeant Bennett, you're in charge of the grappling arrow and rope. Everyone else, weapons and armor only. We don't want to be slowed down. They got to work, and 10 minutes later the Rangers were on their way. Dawson set a wide course well away from the gate. Tiny figures on the wall made it clear the Audin army wasn't stupid enough to leave the rest of the city unguarded. Too bad. But 3 arrows should clear out a large enough section of wall for them to climb safely. At half a mile from the wall, he motioned everyone down, and they continued on their stomachs. Crawling through the high grass surrounding Audin wasn't the most pleasant thing Dawson had ever done, and he had to be careful not to let the blades tickle his nose, lest he sneeze. He smiled when an image of his little girl, Harper, popped into his mind. She turned 8 in 2 months, and Dawson dearly hoped to make it home in time to celebrate with her and her mother. He shook his head and kept moving. Thinking about Harper at a time like this was the surest way to end up not making it home for her birthday. At 100 feet, he stopped and lifted his head just enough to see over the grass. The guards were still right where he expected. That was poor planning on the part of whoever oversaw the city defenses. The men should have been constantly on the move, not standing in one place picking their noses. Dawson pointed at the left-hand guard, then at the ranger on his left. He did the same with the right-hand guard, leaving the one directly above them for him. Now they just had to hope the general could tell time. By some miracle, at the appointed hour, the crash of distant armor stomping across the battlefield reached them. The guards all turned to look, and as soon as they did, he fit an arrow to his bow, drew, and loosed. The other rangers fired an instant later. As expected from his men, the targets all came crashing to the ground with the arrows in their throats. Sergeant, quickly! Bennett fit the grappling arrow to his bow and clipped a thin but strong silk rope to it. The arrow arced up and over the wall. A couple hard tugs confirmed that the prongs had caught. Dawson slung his bow over his shoulder and started climbing hand over hand. His boots occasionally touched the wall, but it provided nothing in the way of toeholds. As soon as he topped the battlements, his bow came back out and an arrow slipped into place. He took up a guard position as the rest of the Rangers climbed up. His men were the best, and the whole process took only minutes. When the last man arrived, the rope went over the inside of the wall, and they climbed down. At the bottom, Dawson held his breath and listened. No shouts of alarm, nothing to indicate that anyone noticed that their perimeter had been breached. In fact, an uncanny silence filled the city. With the citizens hiding out in Audin's rather imposing towers, it would make sneaking around much easier. Using nothing but hand signals, Dawson got his team moving. They carried their bows strung with arrows nocked. No alarm could be raised until they eliminated the target. If that meant taking down an unlucky civilian, they'd do so without a second thought. Keeping to the shadows and making no more noise than a breeze, they soon came within sight of the defender's position. Dawson got his first look at the new suit of magical armor. The design was smoother than any he'd ever seen. The lines of mithril glowed a strong blue even in low-power mode. Though it was kneeling, he suspected it would stand as tall, if not taller, than a Mark IV. No wonder the general was having so much trouble. "Find cover and keep a lookout. If you get a clear shot, take it," Dawson said. The Rangers fanned out, blending into the shadows as naturally in the city as they did in the forest. Now it was a waiting game. 6 hours passed with no sign of movement from the enemy force. Curtis had dozed off several times in his cockpit, only to shake himself awake a moment later. One reason he always volunteered for frontline combat was a complete dislike of waiting. As far as he was concerned, a siege was the worst possible form of combat. Unfortunately, given the numbers arrayed against them, there was no way they could sally forth and drive the invaders away. Even the Mark V wouldn't last long if it got surrounded. Someone clanged on the outside of his armor and said, "Curtis, 2-hour break." At least he could stretch his legs. Curtis powered down the Mark V and disengaged from the control unit. His body complained as he climbed down its leg to the ground. Half the other pilots were out and moving around as well. For his part, Curtis hurried over to a convenient alley to relieve his angry bladder. After a long sigh of relief, he walked back, working the kinks out and generally getting back to normal after standing still for 6 hours. The other guys were doing the same, chatting amongst themselves all the while. One of them waved, but Curtis didn't join the group. He'd never been close to his fellow pilots. Though they worked as a group, ultimately everyone had to fight their own battle. They weren't like the regular infantry, standing shoulder to shoulder as they faced the enemy. Half a dozen women wearing pale gray dresses came striding up, each laden with a covered tray. His mouth watered. A meal would be most welcome. He got in line, and when his turn came, collected a ham and cheese sandwich along with a mug of tepid water. He would have preferred steak and wine, but wasn't about to complain. The girl that offered him his meal, a pretty brunette with high cheekbones and sparkling green eyes, winked, drawing a smile from Curtis. While he might not get along especially well with the other pilots, the ladies had always liked him, and he returned that affection. She took a step closer, but before he could ask where she lived, the woman gasped and fell flat on her face in front of him, an arrow sticking up out of her back. "Enemy in the city!" Curtis's warning proved unnecessary as more arrows came streaking in, hitting serving girls and pilots with dreadful accuracy. Curtis sprinted for the Mark V. An arrow whizzed past his face. He juked left and right, doing anything to mess up the archer's aim. Somehow he reached his armor without getting turned into a pincushion. When he tried to climb the right leg up to the control chamber, an arrow slammed into the metal 6 inches from his hand. He took cover behind the chest. It was a standoff. He couldn't get into the cockpit, and they couldn't put an arrow in him. Not exactly ideal, but at least he'd survived. "Enemy armor attacking the gate," one of the men on duty shouted over the external speakers. Curtis risked a peek around his armor and jerked his head back just ahead of another arrow. The Mark IIIs and IVs on duty wouldn't be enough to keep the attackers out. He needed to activate his armor, but he couldn't do it if he had an arrow in his heart. What were the skirmishers doing? They were supposed to handle things like this, so the big units were free to fight their counterparts without distraction. He snarled away the question. There was nothing for him to do right now other than hope that the archers were neutralized before the enemy armor made it inside the gate. Curtis glanced between the armor's arm and chest, back toward the dead serving girl. There were plenty of pilots lying dead on the ground with her. Unless he was mistaken, no one else had survived the ambush. That meant half their armor was useless. Even if he somehow got in the Mark V, his best option might well be to flee. The armor commander's orders rang loud in his mind. They couldn't let the enemy get their hands on a completed Mark V. Though if Audin fell, he didn't know what difference it would make. A horrible crack of steel on stone drew his attention back to the gate. Crawling to the edge of his armor's foot, he watched as another enemy Mark IV swung a huge sledgehammer at the portcullis arch. Rubble had already piled up, and a couple more swings would send the whole thing crashing to the ground. Time was rapidly running out, and Curtis had no idea what to do about it. The answer came a moment later when the arch came crashing down, still mostly intact. A cloud of rock dust blasted out, obscuring everything, including, hopefully, the archer's vision. Curtis leapt into action, clambering up the side of the armor and sealing the control chamber. He got into position and powered up in record time. When his senses had fully fused with the armor, he made a quick assessment of the situation. It wasn't good. Their side was getting smashed to bits by enemy armor that had rushed through the gap during the dust storm. Even with the Mark V's power, he could do nothing here. The next line of defense would be the castle, and that's where he needed to go. Ilsa made another connection in the second Mark V and wiped sweat from her forehead. Despite spending most of her time working on armor, she knew next to nothing about war, including any offensive spells. Actually, she only knew a handful of what wizards called traditional spells. All her training had gone into magical engineering. Given what was happening in the city, that might have been a poor decision. Why was she even working on the Mark V? She'd need days, if not weeks, to finish everything, and had little hope of getting them. It did help take her mind off the battle raging only a few hundred yards away. Usually her creations were tested much further afield. A war in the city was way too close for comfort. Ilsa smiled up at her creation. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, even if she did say so herself. The door to the armory slammed open, and August stalked in. He looked even worse than usual. Sweat soaked his fancy robe, plastering it to his flabby body. If his scowl got any deeper, she feared his face might break. Rena followed along behind him, her hair sticking up at all angles and generally looking less than her usual stunning self. Ilsa was happy to have someone to talk to, even if they were in a bad mood. "How's the battle going?" she asked. "I don't know," August snarled. "No one's come to update me since we left the portal. It's all that son of a bitch Shank's fault. I don't know how he arranged the assault, but it had to be him. I curse the day I laid eyes on him." "Why would Lord Shank do that?" Ilsa asked. August looked away. "Because he's a no-good, untrustworthy outlander." "The fact that you went back on your promise and tried to steal his artifact probably had something to do with it as well," Rena said. Ilsa stared. She'd never heard Rena say anything even remotely critical of August. She was the most loyal person in the administration. August rounded on her. "You keep your mouth shut. Even if Shank is primarily responsible, you're next on the list of people I blame. You couldn't even follow a simple order. Useless excuse for a servant. Once the army is dealt with, you're next. I'll see you banished, and if you say one more word, executed. Understand?" "Yes, Lord Audin." Rena hung her head, seeming chastened. August turned to look at Ilsa. Before he had a chance to speak, Rena drew a dagger and slammed it into the side of his neck. Blood spurted everywhere, and August collapsed. Rena spit on his body. "Arrogant, stupid, useless piece of filth. All you had to do was keep your word, and you would have had all the mithril you could have wanted. But no, you had to try and take the artifact, even after I warned you how powerful Lord Shank was." "I'm pretty sure he's dead." Ilsa moved back a few steps as the puddle of blood oozed closer. She'd never seen someone killed before, and was glad that she'd skipped lunch. Rena glared at her and raised the dagger. Easy, easy. Ilsa waved her hands as if that'd do any good. Take whatever you want. Do whatever you want. I won't try and stop you. With a final kick to August's side, Rena fled out of the armory. Ilsa blew out a long breath. By the archangels, how did soldiers stand this kind of thing? She'd never been so scared. She looked from the rapidly spreading pool of blood to the partially completed Mark V and debated what to do next. Ilsa was still debating when the operable Mark V came stomping into the armory. It looked undamaged, so what was it doing here instead of fighting? The outer wall has fallen, Curtis said. We need to go. Ilsa looked around. The armory was her whole life. Where was she supposed to go? Curtis lowered the Mark V's hand. If you stay here, you're dead. I can get us out of the city, but there's no time to waste. Ilsa had no intention of dying for her work. She ran over, and Curtis picked her up and set her on his shoulder. She found handholds and took a tight grip. Is that Lord Audin? Curtis asked. Yes. Rena stabbed him, then fled. I thought I was next. We both might be next if I can't get over the wall. Hang on. Despite the Mark V's relatively smooth stride, it still took everything Ilsa had to keep her place on its shoulder. She didn't look back toward the gate. Knowing what was coming wouldn't do her any good. She needed to face forward and figure out how to survive. If they could make it to another city-state, she'd have no trouble finding work. Magical engineers were always in demand, and she doubted anyone would care that she used to work for Audin. They probably wouldn't even ask. Soldiers were equally in demand. As long as they escaped the encircling army, she and Curtis should be okay. The Mark V reached the outer wall opposite the gate without encountering any enemy armor. No surprise, given the unit's superior speed. Ilsa couldn't help smiling despite the situation. This must be how a parent felt when an especially gifted child displayed their talents. Unfortunately, the wall was easily twice as tall as the Mark V. How did Curtis plan to get out? The answer came a moment later when he leapt and swung his right arm full force into the wall. The tips of the armor's fingers dug about half an inch into the stone. Not much, but enough. Slam by slam, the Mark V climbed up and over before dropping to the ground and running full speed away from Audin. Ilsa's hands hurt from her death grip on the armor's safety rung. Even then, it had been all she could do to keep her place. It had all happened so quickly, she didn't even have time to scream. She kicked the side of the armor's head. A little warning next time. Sorry, we're in a bit of a hurry, and I didn't even think to say something. Are you okay? Yeah, fine. Where are you taking us anyway? Other than away from the army, I hadn't thought about it. I've got a little less than 2 hours of operation left. Do you have any suggestions? There was only one place she could think of, but it would take a few days to get there. In the meantime, they needed somewhere to hide until the Mark V recharged. Turn northwest. We can hide in the desert. You've got your survival kit, right? That should get us through a couple days at least. The armor changed course, and soon they were thundering across the fields surrounding Audin. A few startled farmers watched them go, but Ilsa ignored them. When your transport left 6-inch deep, 3-yard-long footprints, worrying about witnesses made no sense. Curtis had to slow down when they reached the forest, but they still made decent time. The Mark V was powerful enough to just knock over all but the biggest trees. It took a good hour, but they finally reached the edge of the desert. The endless expanse of sand and rock had to be the least hospitable area in Greater Audin. Curtis didn't hesitate, striding right out into the dunes. She didn't know how much distance they managed to put between themselves and the city before Curtis stopped and put the Mark V on its knee, but she hoped it was enough. His hand came up, and she hopped into it. As soon as she was on the ground, the back of the armor opened and Curtis climbed down. That's it. She's out of power. How are you holding up? Ilsa considered for a moment, then said, I ache everywhere. I've also been driven from the only home I've ever known, and we're likely already being hunted. But other than that, are you okay?" He held a serious expression for a few seconds before bursting into laughter. Ilsa shook her head. Nothing about their situation struck her as funny, but she did offer a faint smile, more out of thanks for his feeble attempt at cheering her up than anything. They needed to make plans. Unfortunately, she didn't have enough information. When Curtis fell silent, she said, "Feel better?" "Not really. Do you have a plan?" "I was thinking of heading due west toward the city-state of Anston. We can ditch the Mark V at the edge of the desert. Once it's out of the picture, we're just two travelers." He stared at her. "You're kidding. You just want to leave her in the middle of nowhere?" She nodded. Though it pained her, the Mark V was more of a liability than a help right now. If they wanted to survive, they needed to disappear, at least for a little while. "As long as no one knows we're from Audin, we shouldn't have any trouble getting by. Our skills are always in demand." "I guess." Curtis patted the armor's leg. "She's the finest suit of armor I ever piloted." "Seems a waste, but you've got a point. How far to the edge of the desert?" 3 days or so. I've only ever seen it on a map, so I'm not exactly sure." "I don't suppose you know any water-finding spells. There are only 2 skins in the survival kit, and that won't last us long in this heat." Now that he said it, she noticed her throat was dry. "I'll work on it while the crystal recharges. I should be able to come up with something." He nodded, seeming confident that she could do what she claimed. Ilsa dearly hoped his confidence wasn't misplaced. Dawson once again found himself standing, hands clasped behind his back, as General Irving approached. After he and his rangers took out half the enemy armor pilots, the attackers hadn't struggled much with the rest. In fact, surrender had come only an hour into the final assault. All in all, you could hardly ask for a much better outcome. Though judging by the general's scowl, he was about to find out exactly what and how badly he'd screwed up. The general stopped in front of Dawson. "Well, what do you have to say for yourself?" Dawson struggled to keep his expression neutral. "Sir, your mission was to kill the pilot of the new armor. You failed. I trust you have a satisfactory explanation." "A servant stepped into the arrow meant for him at the last second. It was just bad luck. We did kill the rest of the pilots, rendering nearly half the defending units unusable. The new unit fled as soon as the situation became clear. I can't consider that a bad result." "Whether the result was good or bad is irrelevant. You failed. When I give someone under my command a mission, I expect it to be completed perfectly. Would you call this a perfect result, First Ranger Dawson?" "No, sir." "No, indeed. You and your men will hunt down the missing unit and kill the pilot. Should you return to Montague without the man's head, your time—" the general made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire team. "All of your times in the Rangers are over. Now go." They all saluted, and Dawson led them out of the ruined gate. They passed a group of Montague regulars, and the lieutenant in charge gave Dawson a knowing look. Dawson returned a little smile of acknowledgement. Everyone understood what working under General Irving entailed, and they all commiserated when someone fell afoul of his famous temper. At the edge of the Unified Assault Forces camp, they collected their mechanical horses and loaded them with supplies. It was only a few hours until dark, but Dawson had no desire to wait until morning and risk further angering the general. They'd put a dozen miles between themselves and the city, then make camp. Dawson led the way around Audin City and soon found where the new unit emerged. It left tracks so big he could have followed them blindfolded. He looked up at the top of the wall. How had it climbed up? None of Montague's armor could do such a thing. Of course, he'd heard plenty of soldiers from the other city-states mocking Montague's armor program. He thought little enough about it. As a ranger, he had neither the ability nor the desire to pilot the giant armor. They followed the massive footprints until the sun had nearly set. The team got busy setting up their tents near a long cedar hedge separating a dirt road from some poor farmer's field, a field that now had a bunch of massive footprints running through it. The men grumbled as they worked, and Dawson did his best not to listen. He would have been happy to grumble himself, but that wasn't what a commander did. No matter how big a prick his superior was, a good commander kept his mouth shut and did the job. Finally, one of the rangers, a youngster named Jackson that looked like he hadn't started shaving yet, said, "It's not fair, sir. We probably saved thousands of lives, and the general acted like we were total screw-ups. The army would still be trying to get inside if not for us." "You're absolutely right, Jackson," Dawson said. "General Irving was completely unreasonable. He's also still the supreme commander of Montague's army and the king's brother. What exactly do you think we might have done other than what we did?" Whatever Jackson had expected him to say, that hadn't been it. He stared, mouth working like a trout fresh from the creek, saying nothing. "Exactly. You'd have better luck arguing with the city wall than with General Irving. You'd also still have a career. I recommend keeping such thoughts to yourself, lest you end up in trouble that I can't get you out of." Jackson stared at the ground. "Yes, sir." "We really going to hunt that armor down, sir?" Sergeant Bennett asked. "Do you have a better suggestion?" "How about we ride around for a few days, find some wandering minstrel or whatever, and bring his head to the general? It's not like he knows what the pilot looks like." "True, though it might be awkward if the armor shows up somewhere after we kill its pilot." Dawson smiled. "Didn't one of you train to be an armor pilot before transferring to the Rangers?" Elias's hands went up. "I did, sir. The instructor said I had no aptitude for it." "But you could make it walk, right?" "Yes, sir. Even I could do that much." Dawson's smile grew. "Maybe instead of just a head, we bring the general back an even better gift." Ilsa smiled at the contraption she'd cobbled together using spare parts from the armor's repair kit. The device didn't look like much, just a metal rod with runes running its length and a microcrystal attached to the tip with a 3-inch piece of mithril wire she'd dropped in the control chamber while making final adjustments. She channeled ether into the rod and turned in a circle. The crystal burst to life when she pointed north and a little west. Not exactly on their route, but if they needed more water, that was the closest source. Maybe she couldn't hurl fire and lightning, but when it came to making something out of nothing, Ilsa was the best. "So what's that thing?" Curtis was lying in the shade of the armor, one arm covering half his face while he looked at her out of one eye. Sand made a reasonably comfortable bed, and they'd both slept like the dead. Nothing had approached during the night. Any beast would take a look or sniff at the armor and head elsewhere. Humans were few and far between out here, though she had read one time or another about bandits calling the desert home. "This," Ilsa held her contraption out for his inspection, "is a water compass. Just as the name suggests, it points at water rather than north. It's an Ilsa original." Curtis sat up. "Does it work?" "Of course it works." "How do you know?" He seemed genuinely curious rather than mocking. He also had a point. "Well, it activates, and I enchanted it to find water, so I assume that's what it's pointing at. But I suppose until we follow it, we won't know for sure." Curtis stood and grabbed a satchel out of the control chamber. He pulled a strip of dried meat out of it and offered it to her. "What say we chew on the dried leather Supply calls jerky, then see where your stick leads us?" "Works for me." Ilsa took the strip and bit it. Her teeth barely left a mark. This was supposed to be food? "You need to rip a piece off and chew until it softens. Don't rush it. I saw a maintenance guy nearly choke to death on a piece of under-chewed jerky." She thought he was joking again, but his expression said otherwise. She could just imagine surviving the fall of the city, only to die out here, choked to death on a piece of dried meat. If choking didn't get the job done, Embarrassment would finish her off. As soon as their dubious meal was complete, Ilsa found herself once more perched on the armor's shoulder, one hand gripping the familiar hold and the other checking their direction every now and then with her water compass. There wasn't much in the way of landmarks out here, and it would be easy to get off track. The one downside to her compass was it only gave direction, not distance. Since the armor only had 8 hours of operation, she hoped they would make it in time. The survival skins were already half empty. It would be a long, dry night if they didn't reach their destination. Noon came and went, but Ilsa didn't ask for a break. The options for lunch didn't exactly make her mouth water. At least her spot in the shade of the Mark V's head kept the worst of the sun off of her. Curtis had to be miserable in the control chamber. There had to be a way to add cooling magic, but she'd never gotten around to figuring out how. Time passed in a haze of heat and boredom. Eventually, Curtis said, "I'm down to about an hour and a half of operation time. Are we getting close?" "I have no idea." She explained how the compass worked. The water could be 10 minutes or 10 hours away. To his credit, Curtis didn't complain. Not that it would have done much good if he had. "I'll keep going for another hour. I don't like to drain the crystal completely if I can help it. You know, just in case." Ilsa didn't know anything about it. She knew how to build and repair the armor. Actually using it, tactics, and other military matters were completely outside her area of expertise. If Curtis said leaving some power in the armor was the best thing, she'd trust him. Only 15 minutes later, he said, "I see something." She squinted, but couldn't make anything out. Pity she didn't have vision-enhancing magic like the Mark V. "What is it?" "Looks like a village. Want to bet their well is what your toy picked up?" She disliked having her compass called a toy, but the rest she couldn't argue with. "How do you want to approach them?" "Since we're in the middle of the desert, it's probably a bandit village. If they've got lookouts, we've been spotted already. Since the Mark V can't exactly sneak in, I say we approach openly and try to make a trade." "Do we have anything to trade?" she asked. "Labor. Just think how much work I could get done for them in a day with the armor. I figure 6 skins of water gets us out of the desert. 8 hours of work should cover that." "I hope you're right. Let's go." He set out again. 10 strides later, as if it was an afterthought, Curtis added, "If they decide to be disagreeable, I can always level the village and kill everyone. Then we can just take the water. I'd prefer to avoid doing so if possible." Ilsa seconded that. Much as she wanted to survive, slaughtering an entire village pushed the boundary of what she was willing to do. A day in the sun with nothing to drink would probably wipe out some of her scruples, but for now she couldn't stomach the idea. At the edge of the village, a single figure dressed in ragged homespun clothes waited to greet them. She put his age at mid-30s, but that was only a guess. Wind and sun had turned his skin brown and leathery. An environment like this aged people quickly. Curtis brought the Mark V to a halt 1 stride from him. "Greetings," Curtis's voice boomed out of the Mark V speaker. "We were hoping to trade with your village." "Since you didn't bring an army, I'll take your word for it," the villager said. "What do you have to offer?" "This machine's labor plus anything a magical engineer can do for you." Ilsa grumbled to herself at being offered up like a servant, but said nothing. A little engineering work would be a small price to pay for the water they needed. "And what do you want in return?" "Water, enough to reach the western edge of the desert." "That is possible. Can we not speak face to face? I suspect you have a tale worth hearing. We can share stories over dinner." Ilsa's mouth watered at the thought of real food. The Mark V took a knee, and Curtis lifted her down before joining her. He sealed the control chamber, and they walked together to speak with the village representative. "I'm Ilsa. This is Curtis. Thank you for your hospitality." "I am Rayan. Welcome to my village. Come in peace and be at ease. The archangels recently granted me my life. To honor their gift, we have renounced raiding. Follow me." Ilsa and Curtis shared a discreet look. What were the odds they'd find a bandit village that had recently given up plundering? Maybe the archangels were watching out for them as well. Rayanne led them to the largest building in the village. Not that it was anything to get excited about. They could have fit the whole thing in the armory back in Audin, and it wouldn't have been in the way in the least. It was built out of dried mud and had 2 rooms, the larger featuring a table with a handful of chairs that looked stolen from a tavern. From a door deeper in came the smell of meat cooking. It might just have been the finest scent she'd ever encountered. "Please sit," Rayanne gestured toward the table. He went to the door leading to what Ilsa assumed was the kitchen. "We have guests, beloved. Please prepare 2 extra bowls." He rejoined them and sat at the head of the table. An awkward silence followed. Not wanting it to stretch too long, Ilsa said, "You mentioned the archangel sparing your life. What was that about?" He smiled. "On our last raid, we captured a wizard in the hopes of ransoming him. A recovery force was dispatched. They found us. I saw nothing but death in our future, but the young man that led the rescue party spared us. My gift seemed to intrigue him. That is the only reason we survived. His eyes were so cold. They were the eyes of an old man that had seen all the evil the world had to offer and found it unimpressive." Ilsa shivered and described Lord Shank. "Was that the young man?" Rayanne nodded. "Do you know him?" "Only in passing. He recently left Audin for his homeland." "That is well. I fear if those eyes looked upon me again, I might be swallowed up. Anyway, since the gift the archangels granted me is the reason we survived, I deemed it a sign to change our ways." A deeply tanned woman in a simple brown robe emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray laden with steaming bowls. Ilsa's mouth watered. When her bowl was set in front of her along with a wooden spoon, she took a deep breath. It smelled even better up close, savory along with something that tickled her nose in a good way. She dug in even before the woman had finished serving. The first bite hit her tongue and lit her mouth on fire. She'd never eaten anything like it, and while the tangy flavor was nice, she feared her face might melt off from the heat. "What is this?" she gasped the question out. "Adobo stew." Rayanne ate a big spoonful and grinned. "Delicious, no? My wife makes the finest adobo stew in the village." The woman didn't speak, but her brown cheeks darkened when she blushed. Curtis swallowed a mouthful of stew, seeming untroubled by the heat, and said, "Speaking of the village, I didn't see anyone when we entered." "When strangers arrive, everyone goes into their homes and readies their weapons just in case there's trouble. I'm glad there wasn't any." "As are we," Curtis said. They finished their meal in companionable silence. Despite the spice, Ilsa ate every bite of stew. When they were finished, Rayanne's wife collected the bowls and returned to the kitchen. "You've heard my story," Rayanne said. "Please, tell me yours." Curtis looked at her. Ilsa assumed that meant he wanted her to take the lead. Since there wasn't really anything she needed to hide, Ilsa told him everything that had happened in Audin. Curtis added a few details about the attack on the main gate, including the archers that nearly took his life. "Those would be Montague Rangers," Rayanne said with obvious distaste. "They are even more aggressive than Audin when it comes to hunting bandits. They are relentless. If you escaped them, I fear it's only a matter of time before they track you down to finish what they began." "I can't imagine they can hunt us across the desert. One good windstorm and our tracks will disappear," Curtis said. Rayanne shrugged. "It may be as you say, but I advise you never to underestimate the Rangers. It will end badly if you do." "I appreciate the advice," Curtis said. "Now that we know each other a little, how about that water?" "There is something we need help with," Rayanne said, "and your armor would solve the problem easily. You see, a pack of giant lizards has moved into our best hunting site. They've killed or driven away the antelope. If you kill the lizards, we will give you all the water you need, along with skins to carry it." How big of a lizard are we talking about? Ilsa asked. Who cares? Curtis said before Rayan had a chance to answer. Unless their scales are made of metal and 6 inches thick, they won't be an issue for the Mark V. Rayan smiled. They are about twice the size of a horse, and not made of metal. I didn't know lizards got that big, Ilsa said. Neither did we, until they showed up at the oasis. Curtis grinned. The Mark V will be fully charged by morning. Then we'll go out and deal with your pest problem. Is there somewhere we can sleep tonight? Ilsa asked. Rayan spread his hands. My home is yours, assuming sleeping on the floor doesn't bother you. No problem, Ilsa said while not meaning it. The floor looked awfully hard. On the other hand, if the free room came with breakfast, she'd sleep on a bed of nails. Dawson sat astride his mechanical horse and guided it toward the next footprint. The runaway armor was headed due west, and he feared he knew its destination. The Great Desert. Technically, it was part of Audin's territory, but they did nothing with it. Not that there was much you could do with a vast expanse of sand and rock. It mostly harbored snakes, both the legless and two-legged varieties. Finding a giant suit of armor in the vast emptiness would be a major undertaking. Even with their mechanical horses, all of which could operate for 16 hours a day without needing food or water, there was just too much area for his team to search. Sergeant Bennett came riding toward the main group at the head of the scout team. They were still in enemy territory, and Dawson had no desire to ride into an ambush. So far, all they'd run into was an angry farmer who demanded to know who was going to pay to fix his field where the armor stepped on it. Dawson had told him to take his complaint to the capital, not that the new management was apt to care. Bennett saluted and guided his horse in line beside Dawson's. Bad news, sir. Really? On this mission? Bennett coughed to cover a chuckle. Dawson had been doing his best to keep the mood light given the men's annoyance at their treatment by General Irving. Don't keep me in suspense. Yes, sir. They went into the desert just as sure as anything. Soon as they hit the sand, the tracks vanished. Dawson reined in. There was no point just searching blindly. They needed a plan. Still heading due west? Dawson asked. Yes, sir, though they could change course at any time. Noted. For now, let's assume they had a destination in mind. What's on the western edge of the desert? Anston borders it to the west, sir, one of the rangers said. Right, and they didn't take part in the combined raid. That said, I imagine one of the wizards got word to them of Audin's treachery. Since we don't have the supplies to cross the desert, we need to get word to Anston and have them patrol the border. Either they'll deal with the escapee or they'll force him back toward us. You think General Irving is going to be okay with that? Bennett asked. Dawson wanted to yank his hair, what little he had, out of his head at the mention of the general. No, he's not going to be okay with it. Lucky for me, I know a wizard that can get word to Anston. I'll have to sneak into camp and talk to her without the general finding out, but that shouldn't be too hard. Bennett scratched his chin and refused to look at Dawson. If Anston captures or kills the pilot, that's going to raise a lot of questions, isn't it? Especially when the general finds out someone sent word to them without permission. Much as Dawson wanted to shout at Bennett, the good sergeant was correct. He hated it, but Dawson was going to have to speak to General Irving again. That would be about as pleasant as being questioned by Gulmul worshippers. Curtis guided the now fully charged Mark V north of the bandit village. Or maybe he should call it the former bandit village. Though far from a trusting person, everything Rayan said struck Curtis as the truth. He could have been an accomplished liar, of course, but that seemed unlikely. In Curtis's experience, skilled liars tended to spend a lot of time around others. A fair number of officers in the Audin military had the knack, especially when they could apply it to a superior on their endless quest for the next promotion. A smile creased his face despite the baking heat. Curtis never thought about promotion. Piloting magical armor was all he ever wanted to do from the first time he saw them. His entire life up until now had revolved around reaching this point. And what should happen a year after getting his dream post? Audin fell, and he ended up on the run. It wasn't fair. But then, what did fairness have to do with anything? Very little, in his experience. Palm trees jutted out of the sand ahead of him. Is that it? Yes. Rayan had taken Ilsa's place on the armor's shoulder. It had come as a great relief when she didn't argue about staying in the village while he went to kill the giant lizards. Set me down, please. I will stay here while you do what you must. That was an excellent idea. He set Rayan gently on the sand. Do you know how many there are? No. When the hunters saw them the first time, no one felt like hanging around to count. Curtis grinned at that. I'll bet not. How will I know if I got them all? Kill as many as you can. If there are any out of sight, hopefully they'll take the hint and find other hunting grounds. That sounded perfectly reasonable to Curtis, especially if it got them the water they needed. He took the sword out of its holder. I'll be back. With that, he set out for the oasis. Distances in the desert were deceiving, and it took him nearly 10 minutes to reach the oasis. When he arrived, Curtis found 5 massive lizards lying in the sun. He'd seen a monitor lizard once, and these things looked just like them, only about 50 times bigger. One of them turned his way and stuck its forked tongue out. None of them seemed terribly concerned about a giant suit of magical armor stomping their way. He shrugged and broke into a sprint. The nearest lizard made it to its feet a second before his sword cut its head off. Scales, flesh, and bone offered no noticeable resistance to his strike. That got the attention of the remaining 4. They sprang to their feet and rushed at him. Curtis swung again, cutting the closest lizard in half. The remaining 3 hit him at the same time, the combined force knocking him on his back. Their claws scrabbled at his chest plate, and one of them bit the armor's head, blocking his view of anything save the inside of its mouth. The final lizard had his sword arm pinned under its body. How smart were these things? Did they recognize the sword as a threat, or did it just end up on top of that arm? Curtis didn't know, but if they thought pinning his sword was going to save them, then they woefully underestimated the Mark V. He straightened the fingers of his free hand and drove them into the body of the lizard biting the armor's head. Steel fingers drove through its flesh, nearly as easily as the sword had. He grabbed a handful of guts and ripped them out. Even though his hand was perfectly clean, the armor let him feel the blood and slime. That was almost as bad as the horrible noise the lizard made as it died. At least he didn't have time to dwell on it. Curtis gave the lizard scratching at his chest a taste of the same medicine. The final lizard seemed to realize its danger and turned to flee. Not at all willing to let it get away, he gathered his legs under him and sprang after it, now freed sword leading. He skewered it from behind, thus ending the fight. Just to make sure there were no more, he made a full circle around the oasis and found nothing. Not wanting to foul the oasis, Curtis used sand to scrub as much of the blood and gore off his hand and sword as possible. That done, he sheathed the blade and walked back to Rayan. I got 5, he said. Want to take a look? I trust your word. Let us return to the village. Hunters will be dispatched to collect as much meat as possible. Would you be willing to drag one of them back to the village? Not a problem. Curtis went and grabbed the most intact lizard by the tail before pausing to pick Rayan up and set him in his place on the armor's shoulder. It wasn't even midday yet. Maybe they could get their water and get out of here today. That would suit him very well indeed. Ilsa watched the Mark V stomp out into the desert without her. Going on a lizard hunt didn't rate very high on her to-do list, so she hadn't even argued when Curtis suggested she remain behind. His relief amused her. Did he expect women in general to be difficult? Ilsa was pretty sure she hadn't done anything disagreeable during their journey so far. She shrugged and turned back to Rayan's house. As she walked down the small town's only street, villagers slowly emerged from their houses. It was like, now that the armor had gone, it was safe. There was nothing wrong with being wary, but she thought they were taking it a bit too far. Of course, Ilsa had never lived in a bandit village, so maybe it was totally normal to hide from strangers. When she reached the house, she found Rayan's wife standing in the doorway. The sunlight gave her tan skin a pleasant glow, and Ilsa finally realized how attractive she was. In her youth, she had no doubt been a peerless beauty. "So what do you usually do during the day?" Ilsa asked. "They'll probably be gone at least a few hours." "We tend our gardens. Every house has one. The men go out to hunt most days. At least they used to before the lizards show up. Now they must travel further and sometimes are gone for days at a time. This isn't ideal as it leaves the village largely undefended." That explained why everyone was so nervous. "Is there anything I can do?" "Can you pull weeds?" Ilsa smiled. "I believe I can manage that, assuming you show me which ones are the weeds. I've never worked in a garden in my life." The woman's eyes widened. "How did you survive?" "I'm a magical engineer. I designed and built the armor Curtis is piloting. I also worked on many other models. I don't want to be rude or anything, but is it okay for you to tell me your name? It feels wrong to think of you as Rayan's wife." "I'm Marina. Working on magical armor doesn't seem like the sort of work a woman should be doing." Ilsa bristled. "I was the finest magical engineer in Audin. My innovations advanced armor construction by decades." "That may be so." Marina turned and went back inside, leaving Ilsa to follow. "But do you have a husband? Children?" "I'm barely 17. "I take that as a no." They passed through the simple kitchen and out the back door into a yard that was mostly garden. "Bearing the next generation is the most important thing a woman can do. Keep that in mind, as you won't be young forever." Ilsa had never even given a family serious thought, and now that she was on the run, she doubted the subject would come up any time soon. Marina pointed out 2 different green shoots that looked pretty much the same as all the other green shoots and told her to pull only those. Ilsa got to work, but after only 20 minutes her back was screaming for a break. She could work on armor for hours on end, but found weeding far more taxing. Perhaps it was the boredom more than the labor. She straightened and blew out a breath. "Why did you build your village here?" Marina glanced at her but didn't stop working. "The well. It was already here when our grandparents arrived. Such a source of pure water was too valuable to ignore. No matter how much we take, it never runs dry. Common sense says that should not be possible, but it is." Curiosity piqued, Ilsa asked, "Do you mind if I take a look at it?" "You'll never make it as a housewife if you give up on your chores so quickly. But do as you please. This isn't your village after all." Ilsa nodded and hurried back through the house. If this was what being a wife was like, she'd keep as far from marriage as she could. In the town center, she found a simple stone well with a little roof built over it. There was a bucket as well as a dipper hanging from hooks nailed into one of the posts supporting the roof. She took the dipper and scooped out some water. A quick check of the ether confirmed that the water itself was non-magical. It tasted vaguely of minerals. She returned the dipper to its hook and checked the well itself for magic. When she did, it practically lit up in the ether. It was as powerful as anything she'd ever encountered, including the crystal that powered the Mark V, and that was the strongest ever created. Well, well, she'd certainly found something interesting here. The only one she could imagine building something so powerful out in the middle of the desert was Lord Colt. Why he would create a magical well escaped her, but she wanted very much to find out. If nothing else, it would help pass the time. Ilsa placed her fingers on the ground on either side of the well and activated the magical engineer's favorite spell, circuit trace. The magic did exactly what it sounded like. It followed the path of the magical circuit that let the well create endless water. The ether shot out at her command, and her mind reeled. The complexity of the design dwarfed anything she'd ever encountered, or dreamed about, for that matter. It branched over and over, growing ever more detailed. Some of the branches merged back into the main circuit before breaking off again. She couldn't even begin to figure out the magic's purpose, much less how it worked. All magical engineers revered Lord Colt as the greatest of them to ever live. But even so, this circuit was a masterwork. She could have spent her entire life studying its subtleties and still not grasp them all. A vibration ran through the ground, disturbing her concentration. As soon as she lost focus, the trace ended, and she blinked, surprised to find her awareness back in her body. She started to stand and groaned. Everything ached. How long had she been sitting there? Heaven may know, but she certainly didn't. She'd only gotten the vaguest inkling of what the circuit did. But whatever its purpose, it was something far greater than maintaining a well. As best she could tell, the well was actually a vent for a much larger machine. It had to be underground somewhere. "Hey!" She nearly jumped out of her skin when Curtis's amplified voice spoke. She turned to find the Mark V entering the village with the biggest lizard she'd ever seen dragging behind it. It seemed the hunt had gone well. Dusting herself off, Ilsa strode over to the Mark V just as it set Rayan on the ground and took a knee. Curtis emerged a moment later. "Welcome back," she said. "Did you have any issues?" Curtis shook his head. "No, she ran like a dream. Damn lizards managed to knock me off my feet, though." "You didn't damage it, did you?" Ilsa moved in for a closer look. "They might have left some scratches on the chest plate, but that's it." "What were you doing?" "I need to collect some people to help me process the carcass. Excuse me." Rayan sketched a little bow and hurried away. When he'd gone, Ilsa explained what she'd learned about the well. "Amazing, right?" Curtis didn't look overly impressed by her discovery. "I guess, but it doesn't actually affect us, right?" Given their situation, she gave a reluctant shake of her head. "No, I suppose not. Much as I'd like to search for the machine, we have other things to deal with. If we stay here, I fear someone will eventually find us, and that will be the end of these people. Considering all they've done for us, bringing their doom down on their heads would be a poor way of offering our thanks." Curtis grinned. "Remarkably sensible answer, for a wizard. When Rayan gets back, I'll see about our supplies, and we can get out of here." "Maybe after lunch," Ilsa suggested. She'd had her fill of jerky after a single meal. The ride back to Audin was a gloomy one, and Dawson had neither the desire nor the ability to change that. None of them wanted to deal with General Irving again, but they had no choice. Dawson had considered every option and, in the end, decided there was nothing for it but to march in, make his report, and accept whatever happened, for better or worse. 3 miles out, they reached the main road north. A line of people, shackled hand and foot, marched toward Montague in a long line. Infantrymen every 10 paces kept watch over the prisoners. None of them looked like soldiers, and he didn't see any kids. Curious, Dawson guided his mechanical horse over to the nearest soldier, a young man, still in his late teens if Dawson was any judge. He hastened to salute. Dawson returned the gesture a good deal less formally in the hopes that his relaxed attitude would put the soldier at ease. Judging by the tense muscles and grim scowl, he failed miserably. "Where did these prisoners come from?" "Audin, sir. This is our share of the slaves. The other loot is being calculated and divided now." The young man looked around, then said, "Word is, once we've taken everything of value, the entire city is going to be torn down as a warning to anyone that might think of disturbing the balance again." Dawson nodded his thanks and got his mount moving again. He knew the people in charge wanted to send a message, but this seemed excessive. Not that it was his place to say anything. Dawson might be first ranger, but that still put him way down in the ranks. If King Irving and the other rulers decided this was necessary, then he had no choice but to accept it. His own feelings be damned. He rejoined his team and filled them in. Maybe the general will be in a good mood if he's been counting gold and silver, Bennett suggested. Dawson seriously doubted the general was ever in a good mood, but he'd settle for better than usual. They reached the Montague camp half an hour later. Dawson left his mount with the team and went straight for the command tent. The guard outside held up a hand to stop him. "The general isn't to be disturbed. I have an update on the escaped armor and need permission to alert our allies to its approach. Time is of the essence." Dawson wasn't sure that last part was technically true, but it might get him in. The guard grumbled, but finally stuck his head inside the tent. There were mumbled words, and a moment later an aide emerged. Dawson didn't know the man, but from the fine silk tunic, assumed he was a nobleman. "General Irving is busy calculating our share of Audin's wealth." The aide spoke in a high, prissy voice, all but confirming his noble status. "What exactly do you need?" Dawson explained, his tone neutral and showing no sign of his true feelings regarding the nobleman. "The enemy armor is crossing the desert and heading directly for Anston. They need to deploy patrols that will either capture the escapee or turn him back this way. We'll resume our search on the eastern edge of the desert until word arrives that the armor has been captured." The aide nodded. "That seems straightforward enough. Have one of the communications wizards send the message. I'll inform the general when he's finished." Dawson saluted. "Understood, sir." He hurried away before General Irving heard his voice and decided to put in an appearance. He'd dodged an arrow and had no intention of letting his good fortune go to waste. 3 days of stomping through the endless sand brought Ilsa and Curtis to the edge of the desert. The trees in the distance might have been the loveliest sight Ilsa had ever seen. The next loveliest would be a bowl of real food. She'd gnawed enough dried meat to last her a lifetime. At least the mystery of Colt's Well, as she'd come to think of it, had kept her mind occupied during the trek. How Curtis stayed sane she couldn't imagine. Maybe being a soldier helped you get used to endless marching. "Uh-oh." Curtis's concern came through loud and clear when he spoke. "What?" Elsa squinted against the glare, but saw nothing. The Mark V stopped, and Curtis said, "There are enemy units out there. I saw a squad of 4 just pass between some trees. If they're patrolling in force, this close to the desert, it can only mean that someone warned them we'd be coming this way." This was nearly the worst possible outcome. "Can we sneak past them?" "Doubtful. We have seekers for when we're out hunting. I assume they will as well. And even if we go on foot, they'll have spread my description all over. You might be okay, but I seriously doubt there's any chance of me making it into Anston now." Ilsa grimaced. She'd actually forgotten about the Seekers. The magical rods allowed even non-wizards to locate concentrated sources of ethereal energy, making them perfect for hunting down enemy suits of armor. "Do you want me to set you down?" "What?" The question took her totally by surprise. The idea of going in alone hadn't crossed her mind. "No. One way or the other, we're in this together." "Then what do you want to do?" That was, indeed, the question. "We need to go back to Audin. Well, technically, we need to go north of Audin. The only place they won't dare approach is Lord Colt's workshop. If we can make it there, we'll be safe." A stifled laugh came through the speaker. "Safe? Near Colt's workshop? That might be the craziest thing I've heard yet. That place is a death trap. We'd be better off fighting our way past the Anston patrol and trying to find somewhere quiet to settle down." "Lord Shank made it in and out alive. Besides, I don't actually want to enter the workshop. Only get close enough that no one will dare pursue us. And like you said, everyone in Anston will know what you look like. I say we swing back to the village, get another load of water, and make for the workshop." The silence stretched uncomfortably until Curtis said, "Have it your way." The Mark V turned and headed back the way they'd come. Another long, hot hike lay before them, and even if they made it to Lord Colt's workshop, Ilsa had no idea if it would be as safe as she hoped. Still, it was either that or endless, pointless battles until they were captured or killed. Dawson had stopped counting how many times he'd led the Rangers down this particular road. Nearly a week had passed since word was sent to Anston, and no one had come to let Dawson know that the fugitive had been caught. That was both good and bad. He was at least a little pleased to have a chance to get in the General's good graces. The rutted dirt track they were following ran perpendicular to the main trade road north of Audin. He avoided the main road for 2 reasons. The first, and most obvious, being that no fugitive in his right mind would be stupid enough to follow such a busy road. The second was less obvious and more personal. He hated seeing the slaves marching north to Montague. It was a disgusting practice, but a legal one. The former citizens of Audin would undoubtedly find themselves working as either miners or farmhands. He couldn't say which ones he pitied more, the miners who would be dead in 2 years, or the farmers that would be slaves for decades. If given the choice, Dawson would rather fall on his sword. The clatter of metal hooves alerted him to the return of one of his outriders. He spotted Jackson a moment later, approaching at a full gallop. Had he ridden a living horse like that, Dawson would have chewed him up one side and down the other. Their metal horses, fortunately, felt no discomfort, and, if needed, could gallop full speed for 12 hours. "What is it, soldier?" Dawson asked when he finally reined in. "Fresh tracks, sir. Looks like the enemy armor passed through the area less than an hour ago." "Finally." "Show me." The team thundered down the road at full speed. 20 minutes later, they stopped beside a massive track that perfectly matched the missing armor. It was headed east and a little north. Dawson opened the map in his head, and as soon as he did, his face twisted. There was only one thing in that area, and no one in their right mind visited it. Whether you could call a fugitive in enemy territory in their right mind was another matter. "He's headed for Lord Colt's workshop." That brought a round of grumbles from the men, just as Dawson expected it to. "If you're right," Bennett said, "he's as good as dead. We might as well make our report now." "You think General Irving will be content to accept my guess and the workshop's reputation as sufficient proof?" Bennett grimaced. "No, sir." "Nor do I. Let's follow them for now. If we get lucky, the armor will run out of power before it reaches the workshop, and we can take the pilot when he gets out." "The way this mission has been going, counting on luck might not be the best idea, sir," Bennett said. Dawson had no argument for that, but it didn't matter. Heading back in failure would be the end of their careers in the military, and the people of Montague held dishonored soldiers in low regard. On the other hand, at least they'd be alive to get spit on. Ilsa thought leaving the desert behind would be a relief. That was before they reached the forest. The trees towered over the Mark V, and it took all her strength not to get scraped off the armor's shoulder by the many limbs. Her clothes weren't in great shape to begin with, but at this rate she'd be wearing rags by nightfall. "Can't you do anything about the branches?" she asked. "Like what? My sword isn't exactly a machete. If I start swinging in here, whole trees will be going down. Not to mention it'll shorten my hours of operation." He had a point, but they only had a few more miles to go to reach the workshop. Running out of power seemed unlikely. "I've got an idea." The armor stopped, and he put his hand up for her. She got on, and he lowered her down to waist level. The second hand wrapped around her like a shield. "There, that should do it." They started forward again, this time blissfully branch-free. "Thanks." "Not a problem. Did you figure out what we're going to do when we arrive?" Ilsa cocked her head. "Do? I figured we'd make camp a safe distance from the workshop, find a water source, go hunting, and generally rough it for a few weeks. Eventually, whoever's looking for us will get sick of it and go home. The other city-states can't leave their armies here forever. In the grand scheme of things, the two of us are nothing but a nuisance. I hope you're right. Ilsa hoped she was right, too. She guessed it was about 2 hours before sunset when they left the trees behind and emerged in a huge clearing. At the center of it sat a massive walled compound, and, unless she was mistaken, the wall was made of steel. The tops of a number of towers jutted up above the battlements. There appeared to be no way inside. "That's the workshop?" Curtis asked, sounding incredulous. "Sure is. According to the reports I read, there's a magical entry point. But since I have no desire to enter, there's no point looking for it. I say we set up just inside the clearing, but well back from the wall." "No argument here. The Mark V is down to 10 minutes of runtime." Curtis set her down. Then the Mark V knelt, and he joined her on the ground, a sheathed broadsword in his hand. "Man, it's good to be out of there. I love piloting armor, but that was too long even for me. If you don't mind unloading the survival gear, I think I'll go looking for a stream. Our skins are empty." Ilsa nodded. "And rinse off while you're at it. You stink." "Hey, it gets hot in that control chamber." "I'm sure it does, but you still stink." She made a shooing motion and headed for the storage area behind the control chamber. Curtis offered a mocking bow, belted on the sword, and vanished into the woods. Now to get unloaded and set up. It took 10 trips climbing up the Mark V's leg and lugging an armload down, but she finally had everything lined up. There was a small tent, boxes of supplies, and a few useful magical tools. The one for water purification would be especially helpful if they didn't want to end up sick from brook water. She eyed the tent and frowned. Ilsa could build a suit of armor from scratch. Surely she could set up a tent. Dragging the heavy canvas to an open spot near the Mark V, she unfolded it. There were loops for supports, which had to be in one of the boxes she'd lugged down. Muttering unkind words at whoever had designed this thing, she started digging around for the supports. She'd barely gotten started when the first shout rang out. It came from the same direction Curtis went. Dawson and his team had been following the giant tracks for most of an hour when it became undeniable that Lord Colt's workshop was their target's destination. No one had said the obvious yet, but when he glanced at the men's faces, it was clear to Dawson that he was going to have a mutiny on his hands if the armor didn't change course soon. He never considered himself a superstitious man, despite some of the legends that regularly made the rounds in Montague. Fearing a place's reputation wasn't in him. Alas, when they reached the taboo line, it became clear that he was the only one that felt that way. The Rangers all reined in with no word from him. He looked at Bennett and raised an eyebrow. "We'll go no further, sir. Hunting a man, even one in magical armor, is one thing, but going to the workshop is suicide." Dawson opened his mouth to argue once again that the general wouldn't accept their excuses, but Bennett cut him off. "We'll desert and take our chances elsewhere if it comes to that. Honor's no good to a dead man. We'd follow you damn near anywhere, sir, but not there." That brought a chorus of nods. It seemed Bennett spoke for all of them. "So be it." "Make camp here, then. I'll go alone. If I haven't returned in a day, do what you think best." Bennett nodded. "Aye, sir. We can give you that at least." Dawson willed his mount into motion and kept after the tracks. Having to pick his way through the wreckage of the armor's passing slowed him some, but in half an hour he spotted the clearing, and within it, the walled compound that had to be Lord Colt's workshop. His target was heading off toward the woods on the opposite side of the clearing, a load of water skins over his shoulder. What Dawson hadn't expected was the woman. He had no idea who she was, but from the way she struggled with the armor's survival gear, he suspected she was a civilian, maybe a sweetheart rescued before the pilot fled the siege. He shook his head. Whoever she wasn't his concern. The general wanted the pilot's head, The life of a random civilian wouldn't interest him in the least. Dawson dismounted and gave his mechanical horse a mental command to stay where it was. Next he strung his bow and set out. The woods favored a ranger, and with any luck he'd have his target and be back with his men in an hour or two. Curtis only needed 15 minutes to find a narrow little creek cutting through the forest. He'd done his survival training in an area not dissimilar to this, and there had been plenty of creeks there as well. He sniffed and grimaced. Ilsa was right, he did stink. Not that she needed to point it out quite as bluntly as she did. He smiled when he thought of her. She'd proven an interesting companion, better than some he could have mentioned. Best not to think about that. Anyone he might have mentioned was likely either dead or a slave. Thinking ill of them would be both pointless and disrespectful. The more pressing question was whether her idea about just camping out and hoping the enemy got sick of looking for them in a few weeks was likely to be correct. It certainly seemed optimistic to him. Curtis shrugged and stripped his shirt off. A little optimism wouldn't hurt anything just now. Besides, he didn't have any better ideas. He dipped his hand into ice-cold water and sighed. After days in the desert stuck in the Mark V's control chamber, that felt wonderful. He splashed the cold water over his face and chest. Soap would be nice, but the survival kit didn't include any. Smelling bad wouldn't kill you, after all. When he finished washing up, he took the first skin and bent to fill it. Halfway to the brook, he stopped. The forest had gone silent. He hadn't paid attention to the birds' calls, but their sudden absence got his attention. His instincts screamed to move. Curtis leapt right, an instant ahead of an arrow that passed through the space he'd just occupied. It seemed Ilsa's confidence that no one would come this close to Lord Colt's workshop was misplaced. He scrambled to put a tree between him and the archer. "I don't suppose we can end this peacefully." To his surprise, he got an answer. "General Irving wants your head, and I want to keep my job. That means you have to die." That's pretty much what Curtis figured. He needed to get back to the Mark V. He broke cover and sprinted for the clearing. Weaving between the trees, he never went more than a few strides in a straight line. Stumbling over the forest floor litter actually worked in his favor, keeping his movements random. An arrow zipped by his head, missing him by a few inches. Curtis was a fair hand with a sword, but unless he wanted to resort to rock throwing, he had no hope of beating an archer. His only saving grace was that the clearing lay only a quarter-mile from the creek. Of course, with an archer on his tail, that quarter-mile would be the longest of his life. 100 yards into his mad scramble, he tripped on a rock, which saved his life when an arrow whizzed past and buried itself in a nearby pine. Not daring to slow, he scrambled up and kept running. Curtis burst out of the woods and made straight for the armor. Ilsa was wrestling with the survival tent nearby. "Enemy on my tail! Get to cover!" She might not have been a soldier, but Ilsa had sense enough to sprint around the armor, putting it between her and the approaching archer. Curtis slid to a stop beside her just as an arrow plinked off the chest plate. "What happened?" Ilsa asked. "And where's your shirt? That's what you're worried about?" Less worried than curious. "I was washing up when the archer arrived and tried to skewer me. I left both shirt and waterskins behind." "Are you planning to hide behind that armor forever?" the archer asked. "I've got the control chamber covered, so you're not going to get inside." He only had 10 minutes of runtime anyway, so it didn't really matter if he did. "If only he didn't have that bow, I could take him with a sword." "I might be able to do something about the bow." Ilsa's brow furrowed, and she snuck right to the edge of the chest plate. "There he is. Looks like a ranger." A few seconds passed, and she said, "I got it!" Curtis ripped his broadsword free of its sheath and raced to close on the archer. Judging from the camouflage gear and leather breastplate, Ilsa was probably right about this being a ranger. That was considerably worse than a regular archer. The man had discarded his now useless bow, wisps of smoke rising from the severed string. He held an arming sword and dagger and appeared perfectly at ease with his weapons. Curtis guessed his age at 10 years his senior. So much for his theory about having an advantage with a sword. Curtis stopped well out of sword range. "You could still walk away. Tell them we fled to the workshop. No one would blame you for not approaching." The ranger's smile was bitter. "You don't know General Irving. With any other commander, I might take you up on that offer. But the general won't care about the details, only that we failed to complete the mission. Either I'm going to kill you, or my death will hopefully protect my men from the general's wrath. My name is Dawson Gale, and Brannock will judge which of us is worthy of life." It seemed this ranger was an honorable man. That made Curtis even less interested in a fight. "Curtis Yates, may the sword Lord have mercy on our souls." The arming sword went up, and the dagger back. Curtis raised his broadsword and lunged. The arming sword swept his thrust aside, and the dagger nearly opened his throat as he passed by. Back and forth the battle raged. Dawson was every bit as skilled as Curtis had feared. Every exchange made it clearer that he was outmatched. His only hope was to take a risk and pray that Brannock favored him. Leaping with all his might, Curtis chopped down at Dawson's head. The ranger got his sword up, but the metal snapped. Dawson leaned back, avoiding the worst of the strike. The tip of Curtis's broadsword cut down and across Dawson's face, destroying his left eye. For his trouble, Curtis got a foot of steel in his gut. Dawson jerked the blade free and slammed it home again. The pain faded as the world went black. Ilsa could hardly believe her eyes when the ranger stabbed Curtis through the chest. During their time together, the armor pilot had seemed so confident and capable. Somehow she'd assumed that meant he could handle anything. Clearly, that had been a mistake. And if she didn't want to end up just like him, she needed to move. Sprinting from behind the Mark V, Ilsa ran right for the workshop. It was probably stupid, imagining that getting a few 100 yards closer would protect her, but she couldn't think of anything else. Using the trick Lord Shank taught her to sever the ranger's bowstring had been the extent of her offensive abilities. If it came to a fight, she'd live exactly as long as it took him to close the distance between them. She reached the smooth steel wall and risked a look back, fully expecting to find the ranger right behind her. Instead, she found the clearing empty, save for Curtis's now headless body. The ranger's eye had looked pretty bad. He probably went to get healed. Ilsa wanted to be somewhere safe in case he returned. Unfortunately, she saw no way to enter the workshop. The steel felt more like glass when she ran her hands over it. Nothing appeared in the ether until she'd circled halfway around. Over her head was an ethereal hook. She'd seen them before. They were used to seal areas where wizards didn't want non-magic users to enter. She had something similar protecting her room at Audin Castle. Shaping the ether, she attempted to turn the key, and failed miserably. Ilsa knew she wasn't that powerful, but had at least thought she might budge it. Lord Colt probably meant it as a test for anyone that might visit his workshop. Lord Shank must have passed this test. Was he truly that much stronger than her? The obvious answer was yes. She slammed her fist on the wall and winced. That had been rather stupid. A moment later, a hole opened in the wall a couple feet to her right. Her blow couldn't have caused that. It might be a trap, but given the alternative, she'd take her chances. She stepped through and stared. Everything was made of steel. Even the ground was covered in it. A metallic clattering drew her attention to the left. Her throat tightened and her heart raced. Coming toward her was a scorpion made of metal. Its tail arched over its back twice as high as she was tall. Ilsa spun, only to find that the hole in the wall had closed silently behind her. She pressed her back to the wall and watched as the scorpion drew ever closer. Her quest for safety had come to the worst possible end. Perhaps she should have taken her chances with the ranger. The scorpion stopped 10 feet from her. Claws big enough to slice her in half snapped open and closed a few times, far too close to her face for comfort. It stared at her with glowing red eyes, and she stared back, riveted in place by fear. A bluish light appeared, and she squeezed her eyes shut. When nothing killed her after a few seconds, she opened them again. Directly above the scorpion's head shimmered a 3-foot-tall illusion of a man fitted with a number of metal prosthetics, far more advanced than any she'd ever seen. The image could be of only one man. "Lord Colt?"
"Correct, child. This seems to be the season for guests. First the ambitious young wizard, and now a magical engineer. Quite remarkable. Usually people from my land are too fearful to approach the workshop. I imagine you have an interesting story to tell."
"I don't know how interesting you'll find it, my lord, but if you wish to hear it, I'm happy to tell you." Ilsa glanced back at the wall. "Did you let me in?"
"Indeed. I sensed your presence and, being curious, decided to let you in and find out what the fuss was about. Since that young man woke me up, I find I'm reluctant to return to hibernation."
The young man he kept referring to had to be Lord Shank. "Everyone thinks you're dead, my lord."
"Oh, I'm quite dead. What you see is a copy of my intellect stored in this rather formidable body. I can't touch the ether anymore, but as long as I'm in my workshop, I can use all the devices I created before I died. It's a tedious life, which is why I spend so much of it asleep. Now, how about that story?"
Ilsa slumped to the ground and leaned back against the wall. It seemed she wasn't going to die, at least not right now. She took a deep breath and told him everything that had happened from the moment Curtis rescued her during the siege until he opened the wall for her. When she finished, he asked,
"Why did the other city-states attack Audin?"
"I assume they found out about Lord Audin's deal to trade for more mithril. Nothing less than upsetting the balance you maintained would lead to such a drastic action." The illusion's face crinkled up.
"They're still worried about that after all these years. How stupid. I only made sure to give everyone the same amount of mithril so I wouldn't have to listen to any complaints about one getting more than the other. You mortals act so much like children as it is. I didn't want to give you any cause to whine."
Ilsa stared while her brain tried to compute what Lord Colt just said. The 9 city-states' most sacred law was just a way to keep them from complaining to Lord Colt? As if anyone would have dared complain anyway. That might well be the stupidest and most condescending thing she'd ever heard. Not that she had any intention of saying so.
"What do you plan to do now?"
Lord Colt asked, jolting her out of her stupor. "I don't know. The original plan was to hide out here until the invaders left Audin, then sneak back and maybe settle in a little village somewhere. The truth is, I hadn't thought much about it beyond surviving. Is it okay if I stay here for a little while?"
"Certainly. I'd like to hear more about the world outside. My constructs can hunt and bring water. You'll need to do the cooking yourself, of course."
Ilsa lived alone, so that was no problem. She offered a seated bow. "I am most grateful for your hospitality, Lord Colt." She was finally safe. At least for the time being. Dawson hurt everywhere as he marched back to the campsite where he'd left his men. The worst pain came from his bloody face and ruined eye. Apart from the pain, it felt strange having a section of his vision gone. He flicked a glance down at the head in his hand. The armor pilot had put up a good fight. Dawson had never faced one of them before and had assumed that their task left them weak outside of the armor. This man had taught him the error of his ways. His mind drifted to the woman. That she was a wizard became clear when his bowstring snapped. What he couldn't figure out was how she got inside the workshop. Not that it mattered. She wasn't his problem. Bring back the pilot's head, General Irving had said. That's exactly what Dawson meant to do, plus a bonus so the arrogant bastard couldn't claim he'd killed the wrong man. He smelled smoke, and soon enough reached his team. They were seated around a fire and had a pot of coffee brewing. Apparently they weren't so worried about being near the workshop that they felt the need to avoid a campfire. Perhaps songs would be sung later. He shook off his annoyance. It was the pain talking. Everyone scrambled to their feet, eyes wide and staring, when he walked into the campsite. Bennett stared at his face. "Are you okay, sir?" "Sorry, stupid question. Let's get you bandaged up." Dawson sat on a stump near the fire and dropped his prize a few feet away. While Bennett got to work with salve and bandages, Dawson skewered Elias with his one-eyed gaze. "At dawn, we're going back to collect the armor. There's nothing to fear with the pilot dead. I saw nothing dangerous from the workshop. Whatever threat remains, it must be inside." He'd used the tone that made it clear disobedience would not be tolerated. The fact that he'd gone in and come back alive probably helped, as no man wanted to be shamed in front of his brothers. When Bennett finished his work, Dawson drank some brandy and settled in to sleep. Despite the pain, it didn't take him long to doze off. Dawson woke just before sunrise, the same as he did every morning. After a dozen years in the military, he suspected the habit was so ingrained that he'd be waking up at the same time until the day he died, regardless of how tired he felt. He opened his eye and grimaced. Right, just the one now. That would take some getting used to. All around him, the men were waking up and moving around. He sat up and started the fire. There were still coals from the night before, and he had no trouble stoking it back up. Once the coffee was percolating, he glanced at his soon-to-be armor pilot. The young man's hands were trembling. When he noticed Dawson's gaze, he offered a sheepish smile. "I'll be okay, sir. It's just been a while since I climbed into a suit of armor. Never figured I'd do it again." "I never figured I'd willingly walk within sight of Lord Colt's workshop," Bennett said. "Looks like we're all in for an unexpected treat today." Dawson didn't like Bennett's tone, but kept his thoughts to himself. As long as he did as he was told, the rest could be overlooked. For the moment, at least. If it got to be a habit, well, one eye or not, Dawson could deal with that. A breakfast of coffee and bacon raised everyone's spirits, and they were off. The walk only took a couple hours, then they were striding into the clearing. Everything looked almost exactly as Dawson left it. The armor hadn't moved, though the camping gear was gone. The woman probably snuck out and grabbed it all. She was welcome to it. Dawson wouldn't hesitate to kill an enemy soldier, but damned if he'd hunt down a woman. "Is that it?" someone muttered. He wasn't sure if the ranger meant the workshop or the armor, but either way, Dawson had no desire to dawdle. "Enough gawping. Get that armor powered up and let's get out of here before something nasty decides to introduce itself." Elias stared at the armor and shook his head. "I've never seen anything like this thing. I don't even know if I can get it powered up." Dawson put a hand on Elias's shoulder and gave him a none-too-gentle push toward the control chamber. "Try." "Yes, sir." Elias climbed the unit's leg and scrambled inside. Dawson shifted his focus to the smooth, steel walls of the workshop. Everyone else was focused on it as well, not that there was anything to see. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The other rangers were getting antsy. Dawson was too, for that matter. He wanted to get back to camp and find a priest to heal his face. The eye, he feared, was a total loss. Finally, after 15 minutes, the armor stood, and Elias's voice emerged. "I believe I have it now, sir. The controls are very different than the Montag suits." "Grand. Let's get out of here. Lead the way, Elias." The armor took a step into the woods, staggered like a drunk, and fell over into some trees. Sorry, the walking controls are different too." The armor straightened, seeming no worse for its tumble. When it moved this time, it looked a bit like a giant toddler, but at least it didn't fall over. Dawson motioned Bennett over. "Make sure no one gets too close to that thing." I don't think you need to worry about that, sir. Judging by the looks on the men's faces, Bennett was right. The trip back to Audin was one of the more harrowing journeys Dawson could remember. Not because of any outside dangers, but because he feared at any moment Elias might lose control of the enemy armor and come crashing down on him, step on him, or Brannick knew what else. Fortunately for everyone, after the first day he seemed to get at least a partial feel for what he was doing, and they managed to make decent time during the armor's 8 hours of operation. When they finally stopped within sight of Audin's walls, Dawson could only stare. Massive armor units were smashing the city flat. The outer wall had huge holes that were getting bigger by the second. It seemed like a tremendous waste of time and effort, but that wasn't Dawson's call. He had a mission to complete, and if there was any justice in the world, his team would be due a nice, long break. He smiled at the thought of a week of peace and quiet with his wife and daughter. When the shock wore off, they set out for the Montague camp. The perimeter guards scrambled back at the sight of the approaching unit, but they calmed as soon as they realized Dawson and his team were riding right beside it. 2 strides from the sentries, Dawson said, "Hold here, Elias. I'll go see what the general wants to do with his gift. Bennett, give me the bag. I won't be long." His sergeant handed over the burlap sack that held the head of the enemy armor pilot. Dawson had already resolved to say nothing about the woman. She was irrelevant to the mission, and with his luck, the general would order them to return and bring her head back as well. A second trip to the workshop might well result in an actual mutiny. He'd avoided one the first time only by the hair of his chin. Shaking his head, Dawson urged his mount forward. "Is the general in his tent?" The older of the 2 sentries said. "No, sir. The general left for Montague City 2 days ago along with our share of the loot. Not that any of us are liable to see a copper of it." Though voicing such an opinion out loud wasn't the wisest decision, Dawson could find no fault with the truth of it. "Who's in charge, then?" "That would be Colonel Hawley, sir. He's taken over the general's tent." "Thanks." Dawson knew Hawley. He was a good man. Far better than General Irving, anyway. "No problem, sir." The sentry looked back at the armor and said, "How long are you going to leave that thing here?" "Until someone tells me where to take it." Dawson left the guard post and made his way toward the center of camp. There were far fewer tents and soldiers around. Most probably returned with General Irving. Didn't look like there was much to be done here in any case. He reached the command tent and found the same weary guard standing out front. "Can I help you, Ranger?" "My team has completed its mission and we're reporting in. Is the colonel available?" Before the guard had a chance to answer, the tent flap was brushed aside and a brute of a man stepped out. He wore a brown and green uniform that struggled to contain the breadth of his shoulders. "Dawson," Colonel Hawley said. "I heard the general sent you on a long hunt. Glad you survived, for the most part." "Thank you, sir." Dawson held up the sack. "The pilot's head, as ordered." Hawley grimaced. "Noted. Now get rid of it and get yourself to the healer's tent." "There's one other thing, sir. We brought the pilot's armor back with us. What should we do with it?" "Let's see what you got." Dawson dropped the head beside the guard and led Hawley back to where his team was waiting. As soon as he saw the armor, Hawley stood stock still. "That's one of the new units. Our magical engineers almost shit themselves when they saw the incomplete one in Audin's armory." "Has anyone else seen it?" "We came straight here, sir. I can't say if anyone saw it from a distance. Since none of the other commanders are riding toward us, I assume no one noticed exactly what you have. Here are your orders. Send your team and the armor north at once. They're to speak to no one, and keep well off the main road. No unnecessary stops until you reach Montague City. As for you, get to the healers, then catch up. Can't have you falling over dead of an infection." "Understood, sir." Dawson saluted. So much for a long rest. Dawson hadn't counted the days they'd been traveling, But even with only 8 hours of operation, the armor's long strides devoured the miles. When the forest grew thick with evergreens, he allowed himself to relax a fraction. They were back in Montague. Ahead of them, Montague City waited. It wasn't that different looking from Audin from a distance. When you got closer, that changed. For one thing, all the buildings were made of wood, and the population was less than half of Audin's. At the center of the city sat Castle Montague. Since riding unannounced up to the city with a suit of enemy armor struck Dawson as a poor idea, he dispatched Bennett to let the watch know they were on their way. "Sir," Elias's voice came through the armor's speakers. The youthful ranger had done a fine job piloting the armor despite his lack of confidence. "There are a lot of people waiting in front of the gate." Dawson squinted but couldn't make out any details from this distance. "Do you see any of our armor?" "No, sir." "Then don't worry about it. If they feared our arrival, they'd have more than infantry waiting for us." Dawson dearly hoped he was right about that. Half an hour later, he was greeted by the most remarkable sight. 2 full companies dressed in green and black uniforms stood on either side of a gathering that included King Irving, his brother, the general, both princes, and a bunch of other men Dawson didn't recognize but assumed were important. "Best behavior, everyone," Dawson said. "And I mean best. One screw up here and you'll wish whatever lived in the workshop got you." No one spoke, but the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The rangers stopped 3 strides from the gathering, and Elias had the armor kneel. Once he was outside, the rest of them dismounted and approached on foot. A safe distance from the king, they took a knee. "You would be Dawson Gale," King Irving said. Though in his 50s, nothing about the king was soft, unlike his brother. He wore fine green and black robes trimmed with sable fur. Dawson gave thanks to Brannock and all the other archangels that they had him instead of his younger brother as king. "I am honored that you know my name, Majesty. At Colonel Hawley's command, we've returned with the captured enemy armor." "Splendid work. Bandon won the right to the incomplete one discovered in Audin's armory, so we'll be the only other city-state with access, and ours is complete. Our magical engineers are eager to study it." "Of course, Majesty. Do you wish us to take it anywhere in particular?" "No need." The king pointed at one of the gathered men, then at the armor. He saluted, hurried over, and climbed in. "You shall all be well rewarded for this. I'm granting your team a 1-week furlough, after which you shall come to the castle and tell me what you want. If it is within my power to grant it, I shall." With that, the king and most of his entourage turned and strode back toward the city. Only General Irving remained behind. Dawson stood and saluted his commanding officer. "Well, you completed the mission. That's more than I expected after your earlier failures. One word of advice. When you speak to my brother again, don't get greedy." With that, the general stalked off after the rest of the royal party. Foolishly, as it turned out, Dawson had expected a word of appreciation from the general. He blew out a long sigh. A week of rest would be most welcome. He turned to his men. "You heard the king. You're all dismissed until we meet again in 1 week. Enjoy the break. You've earned it." Dawson mounted his mechanical horse and guided it away from the city. Unlike the others, he and his family lived in a log cabin near the forest an hour east of the capital. It didn't seem like much, but once you left the immediate area around the city, it was almost like another world, one where people were few and far between. Right now, he dearly wished for the quiet of home. When his log cabin came into view, Dawson let out a long sigh. The tension in his back and shoulders relaxed, and a slow smile spread over his face. The war with Audin had extended his deployment by a month, so it had been 4 since he'd seen his home. The 2-story log cabin, with its green tile roof and wraparound porch, had never looked so sweet. 20 yards out, he heard a twang and grinned. Harper was practicing with her bow. He admired his daughter's dedication, but sometimes she overdid it and came in with bloody fingers. He dismounted in front of the steps and climbed up to the door. Not wanting to barge in and give his wife a heart attack, he knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened and Sophie's wide-eyed face filled his vision. Dawson swore she got more beautiful every year. Tears slowly filled her blue eyes. "Hello, darling. Did you miss me?" She leapt into his arms and kissed him. Dawson held her, and for the first time since the war began, he knew everything would be okay. When Sophie finally let him go, she reached up and touched the side of his face. "Your eye." "Yeah. I found a swordsman that knew his business, though not quite well enough." They went inside, and Dawson sank into his favorite leather chair. Sophie went to the back door and said, "Harper, your father's home." The sound of pounding footsteps heralded his daughter's arrival. A moment later, he had an 8-year-old sitting on his lap. "I'm so glad you're back, Dad." "As am I, sweetie. I heard you practicing." She beamed. "I switched to the 35-pounder. It's a stretch, but I can already shoot 10 before I need a break." He nodded, keeping his expression serious. She worked so hard that it would be an insult to show how adorable he found her. "And your sword work?" "I do an hour of forms every morning, but it's hard to practice without a sparring partner." "I can help with that, but only if you promise to go easy on your poor old father." "Promise." She hugged him and pressed her head into his chest. "Harpergale, there will be no more practice if your math work doesn't improve." Sophie stood over them, arms crossed. "Mom, a hunter doesn't need math as bad as she does good aim." "She does if she doesn't want to get cheated by the merchants that buy her pelts." Dawson ruffled her hair. "Go see to your studies. We'll spend an hour in the circle in the morning after breakfast." Harper's green eyes sparkled. "Just wait until you see how much I've learned." She ran off and pounded up the stairs to her room. Dawson shook his head. If he had half his daughter's energy, he'd run circles around his men. Sophie took Harper's spot on his lap and put her arms around his neck. "Do you want to talk about it?" Dawson had sworn when they got married he'd never keep anything from his wife, and he never had. He told her everything, and when he finished, said, "What do you think about moving away from the capital?" "What did she have in mind?" "She didn't shoot him down at once, which meant she'd at least consider it." "Doing ranger work with one eye is too risky. I thought I might ask the king for a sheriff position in my old hometown. There are miles of forest where Harper can play, and nothing exciting ever happens. It'll be a peaceful retirement, but only if you want to." "As long as we're together, I don't care where we live. It would be nice to have you home every night rather than wondering what you were dealing with who knows where." Dawson nodded. Being home every night would be like heaven. "Then that's what I'll ask for. Not having to deal with General Irving again will be a nice bonus." Ilsa spent her first night in the workshop sleeping in one of the towers. Lord Colt, she knew the simulacrum controlling the mechanical scorpion wasn't really him, but she decided to think of him that way for simplicity's sake, had sent drones out to collect her survival gear, which included enough food for a few days. The tower, happily, had a well that produced water at the turn of a handle, so at least she wouldn't have to worry about that. After a breakfast of hardtack and jerky, she went outside and found Lord Colt waiting. She bowed and said, "Good morning, my lord."
"Yes, it is. Did you sleep well?"
"I did, thank you. I must admit I was surprised to find such a well-preserved bed. After all this time, I figured everything not made of steel would have deteriorated."
"We have magic to deal with that sort of thing. No big deal. I know you said you wanted to stay here for a while."
Her throat tightened. Was he going to kick her out?
"But I wondered if you had any thoughts about what you'd like to do while you were here."
She blew out a sigh. Looked like he wasn't. "I hadn't really thought about it."
You're a magical engineer, correct? Perhaps I could give you a few pointers. It's been a long time since I had any apprentices.
To study with the greatest magical engineer of all time would be an amazing honor, Lord Colt. Thank you.
Oh, I almost forgot. Some men came and made off with your armor. I debated stopping them, but figured we'd have fewer people poking around if I let them take it.
Ilsa thought for a moment, then shrugged. She couldn't use the armor anyway, so what difference did it make? What should we do first?
I'll show you around the workshop, and you can tell me what's been happening out in the world.
And that's just what they did. After that first tour, the pair settled into a regular daily routine with Lord Colt lecturing her, then Ilsa going into one of the towers to work in the afternoon. That had been her routine for months now, and she loved every minute of it. Lord Colt knew so much, and she could hardly process most of it. It went that way for over a year, before something strange happened. They were discussing Mithril's ethereal absorption rate when Lord Colt's illusory body shimmered, vanished, then reappeared after about 5 seconds. She'd never seen him do that before. Is everything okay, my lord?
I'm not entirely certain. Lord Valtan has died and all the portals are now depowered. How that could be possible, I don't know, but I felt it through the ether.
His scorpion body clattered around so it was facing her straight on.
Do you still wish to go visit the wizard that took the chamber?
Lord Shank said that the portal wouldn't open unless he allowed it. Anyway, you just said there's no power to them.
That's what makes it possible for you to go. When the portal lost power, it erased whatever spells were in effect. You just need to power it back up and touch the correct rune. So, do you wish to go?
She almost laughed, then caught herself. If Lord Colt was suggesting that it was possible to power up the portal despite her lack of personal power, then he must have some way to make it happen. Given that, Ilsa had to decide if she really did want to leave the workshop. Different food would be nice, and Lord Shank made it clear that he would welcome her and her skills, but it would also mean leaving behind the greatest source of knowledge she'd ever encountered. Finally, she asked, If I leave, can I come back?
Of course you can, and bring that boy with you. He had potential.
Ilsa doubted Lord Shank would like being called a boy, even by Lord Colt, but leaving that aside, if she could leave and return any time she wanted to, there was really no reason not to go. What do I need to do?
You need to build an ethereal capacitor. It's basically like the crystals you use to power the magical armor, only on a greater scale.
He went on to describe the process, and Ilsa actually understood about half of it the first time through. It was clear to her that building the device wasn't going to be a quick or simple task. She smiled. Ilsa loved a challenge. Ilsa ended up needing 6 months to build the capacitor, mostly because she had to stop every couple of days and have Lord Colt explain one of the processes to her in greater detail. On the plus side, her understanding of magical engineering theory had expanded tremendously. Assuming Lord Shank kept his promise and gave her access to all the mithril she wanted and all the help she'd need, Ilsa felt confident that she could make the finest armor anyone had ever seen. But first, she needed to get to the portal. She knew that the capacitor held a powerful charge of ether, but until she applied it to the portal, Ilsa wouldn't know for sure if it was enough. She dearly hoped it was, since starting over and spending another 6 months making a new one didn't excite her. Also, hard as it was for her to believe, she wanted to see people again. And so, a few days ago, she'd set out for Audin. The capacitor fit neatly in a backpack along with food, water, and other basics. In a holster at her hip was a crystal-tipped lightning rod that would be sure to dissuade anyone looking to cause her trouble, not that she'd met many people on her journey. Merchant traffic was non-existent, and the few farmers she encountered offered silent nods of acknowledgement but didn't speak. She wanted to ask what she might find in Audin, but their sullen silence didn't encourage questions, so she trudged on and hoped for the best. When a glint in the distance caught her attention, she stopped and stared. It was the noon sun reflecting off the top of Audin's portal. But where were the walls? And the towers? The only thing still standing seemed to be the portal itself. Ilsa shook her head and set out again. She needed to get closer to find out what was happening. An hour later, she stood in front of heaps of rubble that used to be Audin's walls. They'd been torn down along with every building in the city. All the people were gone as well. It seemed impossible and pointless, yet the facts were undeniable. She sighed and started picking her way through the heaps of broken rock. So much lost to one man's arrogance. If August had just kept his word, none of this would have happened. But the past was the past, and she needed to move forward. She finally made it through the debris to reach an open path that used to be a road. On the plus side, it looked like it stayed clear all the way to the portal. Walking through the empty, ruined city gave her an eerie feeling. Every time she spotted a familiar turn of the road, Ilsa expected to come around the bend and find a cafe she used to visit or a favorite shop. But it was all gone, and she had to accept that. About halfway to the portal, a rustling in the rubble drew her attention. She doubted there could be anything here to interest an animal, but human scavengers were a distinct possibility. To be safe, she drew the lightning rod as she walked. Moments later, a filthy man in ragged clothes stood up from amidst the broken rock. He looked like he hadn't shaved in weeks, or bathed in even longer. He leered at her with beady, narrow eyes. Ilsa charged the rod with ether and kept moving. "Where you going, girl?" the scavenger asked. "There ain't much here, and those of us that have been around a while don't like to share. I'm the reasonable sort, so if you make it worth my while, I might let you stay in my territory." A suggestive waggle of his eyebrows made it clear what he expected for payment. Ilsa would sooner slit her own wrists. "I'm just passing through. Good day." So saying, she picked up her pace. Leaving wasn't an option. He leapt across the rubble toward her. Ilsa leveled the rod at him and finished charging it. Sparks shot off the tip. "I'll warn you once to back off." He grinned, revealing a mouthful of broken teeth. "Or what? You're going to poke me with your little stick?" When he took another step toward her, Ilsa loosed the gathered power. Lightning crackled into the scavenger's body. He went rigid. Steam shot out of his ears, and finally his blackened corpse fell to the ground. She swallowed hard and ran away before the smell of burned meat made her throw up. Her weapon stayed out, and she started charging it again. He'd made it clear that there were others like him in the ruin, and she had no interest in running into them unprepared. By some miracle, Ilsa reached the portal without encountering any more locals. Not wanting to push her luck, she immediately shrugged out of her pack and attached the mithril wires to the portal. A nudge of ether got the flow of energy going. It took nearly 10 minutes, but the first rune flared to life. She smiled and blew out the breath she'd been holding. This was going to work. She knew it. Fortress Commander Don wasn't entirely sure what he'd done or who he'd offended to get assigned to watch the Garen portal, but he swore to himself that as soon as he found out, he'd apologize. For 3 months he'd been stationed here, on duty 12 hours a day from 7 in the morning until 7 at night. He commanded a standard complement of 100 men, all of them skilled and capable soldiers, all of them wasted guarding a portal that hadn't operated in 6 months. It was folly. Absolute folly. However, Don had a strong preference for living, so he had yet to make any complaints to his immediate superior. All members of the Portal Guard answered to only one man, Otto Schenk, and none of them, from the newest recruit to the most senior officer, would ever voice a word of complaint where Lord Schenk might hear them. In fact, Don tried his best not to even think anything negative when Lord Shank was around. Doing so would be suicide, and not the career kind. He leaned back in his chair and stretched his arms toward the ceiling. His tiny quarters consisted of a cot, footlocker, desk, and chair. Not exactly lavish, but certainly better than bunking with his men in the barracks. And the post wasn't really that bad, just boring. Right now, all the posts were boring, and none of the soldiers minded. Boring meant no one was trying to kill you. Never a bad thing in this line of work. The thud of racing footsteps brought his musings to a close. Running soldiers never signaled anything good. Heavy blows on the door were followed by a panicked voice. "Sir, we need you in the yard right now." He pulled open the door. "What is it?" "The portal is lighting up." That would teach him to complain. "Show me." Don followed the terrified young man to the yard where all the soldiers had gathered to stare at the portal. 2 runes had burst into white light, just as they used to when power still flowed to it. As he watched, a 3rd rune gradually brightened. Whatever was going on, it was over his head. He grabbed the nearest man and thrust at him a special steel amulet marked with an image of the portal on the front and a strange sigil on the back. Don had no idea what it meant, only that he was told that if there was ever an emergency at the portal, he was to show that amulet to any guard at either the palace or Franken Manor, and Lord Shank would be summoned instantly. "Go to the palace first. Lord Shank will most likely be there at this time of day." Don had no idea if that was true, but it was a good place to start. "Hurry!" "Yes, sir." The soldier sprinted out of the fort like a rabbit fleeing a fox. Don turned his attention back to the portal and grimaced. What sort of horror was going to emerge from it? He had no idea, but doubted it would be pleasant. Otto Shank read the final page of a 1,000-year-old book he'd taken from one of Lord Coronan's libraries and set it on the table beside his overstuffed leather chair. It wasn't even a book of magical theory, but a very interesting history. He planned to let Wulfric read it as well if he was so inclined, and given the Emperor's taste for historical texts, Otto felt certain he'd partake. After that, it might end up here in the Imperial Library instead of back where Otto found it. It was tremendously enjoyable to be able to spend 2 days doing nothing but reading for the sheer pleasure of it. The Empire had been quiet since the deaths of Valtan and Ahmet Sur. The most pressing problem was road repair, and that didn't exactly require Otto's personal attention. He had learned a few more magical tricks, but nothing that increased his personal power by more than a fraction. He hadn't given up on getting stronger. It was just that having the Chamber of Eternity to extend his life indefinitely, combined with the lack of external threats, drained some of the motivation that had been pushing him for the past few years. He had yet to decide if that was a good thing or not. The library door burst open, and Otto turned to glare on the guard standing in the doorway. This had better be good. He held out a very special steel amulet and said, "The portal is powering up." Otto leapt out of his chair and ran over to the guard. "Tell me everything." "I just did, my lord. That's all the messenger knew." Otto snatched the amulet out of the man's hand, became one with the ether, and reappeared a moment later in the portal fortress. Half the runes had begun to glow, and as he watched, another one slowly sprang to life. He'd never seen the portal act like this. Not that his knowledge about the portal's functioning would fill a very big book. Every soldier in the fort had gathered around the portal, and they were pointing their spears at it, as if a wizard powerful enough to activate the portal would be harmed by simple steel weapons. "Commander Don," Otto said. The soldiers all leapt at the sound of his voice. They spun to face him, as if expecting an attack. When they saw who it was, their spears immediately dropped. A lean, scowling man in his mid-30s separated himself from the group and saluted. His black and gold uniform was damp with sweat, a comment more on the tension than the weather. "Lord Shank, thank heaven. The runes just started lighting up, and they've been slowly working their way around the hoop. What does it mean?" "I haven't the slightest idea, Commander." Otto nearly laughed when the man's jaw dropped. "But we'll find out together. Have your men back away and lower their weapons. If whatever comes through is a threat, mere steel will be of little use. And if it isn't, I don't want them stabbing a potential ally. Yes, Lord Shank. Commander Dawn bellowed orders, and soon a safe space 15 feet wide had been made between the soldiers and the portal. An excruciating half-hour later, the final rune energized, and power flooded the space inside the portal. A heartbeat later, a single figure lunged through, and the power vanished. Of all the potential visitors Otto had anticipated, a disheveled young woman with a backpack didn't make the list. She stood and brushed herself off. Otto frowned. She looked familiar. Ilsa? She looked up and beamed at him. Lord Shank! You remember me! It's been over 2 years and I wasn't sure you would. I hope your invitation for a visit is still open. It certainly is. Welcome to Garen. You're looking a bit rough around the edges. How about we go to my home and get you some clean clothes and a meal? Her smile was radiant. That would be wonderful, my lord. Excellent. Excuse me for a moment. Otto walked over to Commander Dawn and returned his amulet. All is well, Commander. Your reactions were flawless, and I will keep them in mind should the opportunity for a promotion arise. Dawn saluted again. An honor to serve, my lord. Otto led Ilsa out of the fort and toward Franken Manor. As they walked, he said, Your arrival was certainly dramatic. How did you activate the portal? With Voltan dead, I'd assumed it was virtually impossible. With this, she held out the backpack. It's an ethereal capacitor. Lord Colt helped me build it. You can charge it over time, then release the gathered power in one shot. To be honest, I wasn't sure it would be enough to activate the portal until the final rune started glowing. Otto's mind raced at the possibilities. If he could build more of them and make them more efficient, he could rebuild the portal network. Lord Colt said that if you wanted to come back with me sometime, he'd be happy to include you in our study sessions. When you say Lord Colt, you mean the simulacrum? Yes, it's incredibly knowledgeable, but can't manipulate the ether. I've been studying with him since Audin's fall and acting as sort of a pair of magical hands. If you come with me, I'm sure we could accomplish even more. Maybe you'd better tell me everything, Otto grinned. This was exactly what he needed to kick himself out of his recent funk. Adding the spirit of a second arcane lord to his list of instructors could only increase his power further. He could hardly wait to get started.
I hope you enjoyed The War with Audin. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of my uploads. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.